Thank you, Schneier. It's very interesting that you say that. I'll refer back to what you said a little later in the speech. But as most of you know, Justice Scalia passed away a couple of weeks ago. And I want to talk a little bit about him tonight and his connection to us, to Judaism. And it's very interesting. Justice Scalia almost identified himself as a Jew. He was a Catholic, but he had a lot of pride on the fact that he was, for a while, the only Jew on the court. He was appointed in 1986, and until 1993, when Ruth Bader Ginsburg was appointed, he was the only Jew. And he said he was the first justice to use the word chutzpah with a CH, not with the H, in an opinion. And he had to correct the Chief Justice, William Rehnquist, when he pronounced yeshiva. He said, no, it's pronounced yeshiva. And then he explained to him what yeshiva was. So he actually preferred to hire Orthodox clerks. He had a couple of Orthodox clerks, some Talmudic and big from law clerks, and he did give. He did feel that the Talmudic learning that they did gave them an advantage, and he was actually a guest speaker at a lot of Jewish functions. And he spoke at the Aguda dinner once. He was one of the keynote speaker. So I want to just briefly talk about three of his opinions, three of his writings where he interacted and quoted Jewish sources. And it's interesting, each one has a little different twist. There's a case called United States versus Sun Diamond Growers of California. This is a case about a federal agent and bribes, certain bribes, whether or not the bribe had to actually be linked to any certain event that he was doing. So if, let's say, you have a federal official and he's getting gifts, was that considered a bribe, even if it's not linked to any event or any specific goal? So the Supreme Court in that case ruled that it wasn't. It's not a bribe if it's not linked to an event. And Scalia wrote the opinion, and he starts with the opinion. He says, Talmudic sages believed that judges who accepted bribes would be punished by eventually losing all knowledge of the divine law. Now what's really interesting about this quote by Scalia is, at this point, and this is from an article by Nat Lewin, who was a big Supreme Court lawyer who was also an Orthodox Jew, he didn't have a Jewish clerk at this time. And this is not a well-known saying or tradition that we have. It's based on a Rashi and Mishpatim, and it's not even a Gemara. Rashi's quoting a Mechilta. So I don't know where Scalia got this Rashi and Chumash from, but he starts off his opinion on a case which didn't have to do with judges necessarily. It had to do with federal non-judge officials, and it didn't have to do with whether or not there would be a punishment. But he sort of looked to Torah, looked to the Talmud to find sort of like a wisdom that he felt necessary to express in the United States Supreme Court opinion. Now we go, and what's even more interesting was that Scalia was a stickler for citations. He used to make his clerks, anytime they quoted a source, he would make them bring the actual volume where they got that source from. Nowadays everything's online and everything's through research engines, search engines, but he would actually make them get the hard copy and bring it to him, and that's the source, and he would ask them to connect the source. He doesn't quote any source here for this saying, which is not so easy to find. In another case, that's the first one. In another case, which is a better known source, he actually brings the source, and it's really interesting what he says. This case is called Caperton versus 18 Massey Coal Company. This was a case where a $50 million case against some coal company, and the issue in this case was whether or not a judge who was elected, in certain states judges are elected, not appointed, if there were a lot of political contributions to this judge's campaign, if he had to recuse himself, if he had to remove himself from the bench. So the Supreme Court said that yes, he has to remove himself from the bench. And they found it in something called in the Constitution called the Due Process Clause, which basically means you have to be fair in court. And they said, yep, the Constitution talks about this, and it says that judges have to recuse themselves. Scalia he didn't like that. He felt that they put too much into the Constitution. They would stretch it out. So this is what he says. He writes a dissent. It's a 40-page opinion, but his dissent is only like 2 pages. And And he says, a Talmudic maxim instructs with respect to the scripture. Turn it over and turn it over, for all is therein. 8e, Babylonian Talmud, Seder Nezikin, Tractate Aboth, Chapter 5, Mishnah 22, page 7677, Isidore Epstein, edition 1935. And then he says, divinely inspired text may contain the answers to all earthly questions. Okay? Divinely inspired text may contain the answers to all earthly questions, but the due process clause most assuredly does not. He says, the court today continues its quixotic quest to right all wrongs and repair all imperfections through the Constitution. So what he's saying is basically in Yeshivish, the Havdil Aleph Avdolis, they're trying to, which means a million miles apart, these Supreme Court judges think that everything is in the Constitution. Whatever they need to answer, no matter what question it is, from 200 years, 300 years, it's all in the Constitution. He goes, it's not like that. One thing, if you want to say the Torah has everything in it, hafech ba v'hafech ba dekulei ba, that's the Mishnah Novis that he's quoting, that if you constantly turn it over and research it, then you could find the truth, but not in the Constitution. So that's the second episode, and here he does quote it, which is better known. Here he does seem to quote it. The third and last one I want to talk about is an interesting case that Nat Lewin actually argued in front of the Supreme Court, and this was a case called, I don't know the name of the case, I think it was Board of Ed versus Kiryat Joel. And this was a case about the Satmar community that the problem there was that Satmar in Kiryat Joel is completely religious, and their schools were being funded by the state, by the government, but what happened was that the state ended up funding religious kids, only religious kids. So there was a problem of a violation of church and state. That was the issue there. Is it okay that the state is providing services for one religious group over the others? So here, Scalia was very sarcastic in a lot of his opinions. So he did not feel that this was a problem. And what he wrote is, the court today finds that the powers that be up in Albany have conspired to effect an establishment of Satmar Hasidim. An establishment is the word the Constitution uses, that the state was not allowed to make an establishment of religion. I do not know who would be more surprised at this discovery, that Satmar was called an establishment. The founders of our nation or Grand Rabbi Joel Teitelbaum, founder of the Satmar. So he's saying, the Grand Rabbi would be astounded to learn that after escaping brutal persecution and coming to America with the modest hope of religious toleration for their ascetic form of Judaism, that Satmar had become so powerful, so closely allied with Mammon, as to have become an establishment of the Empire State. So, this Scalia, he had something for the Jews, and by no means do I mean to say that the Torah needs a Supreme Court justice to give it any more pride or anything, but I think what's interesting is I think it's a Kiddush Hashem that at the highest level of American jurisprudence and at the highest level of intellectual rigor and sharpness, a Supreme Court justice looked to the Torah to find some wisdom that he couldn't find in all the laws and all the other books. And I think it's something that at his death we should take from that as a lesson.